Hello, welcome back to the Disaster Dialogues, where history goes horribly wrong. Today we're hearing about the case of William Saville, a murderer who killed 18 people after his own execution. He was executed for the murder of his wife and their 3 children, but that wasn't the end of the deaths. So what exactly happened on Garner's Hill in Nottingham on the 7th of August 1844? The Saville family lived near Colic, and they were all buried, apart from William, their murderer, at Colic Parish Church. The parish burial register actually says in the margin, all these were murdered. There was only one entry for all 4 people. Anne had married William in 1835, and she was 10 years older than him and only had sight in one eye. William was not unknown to the law, having been convicted of larceny in 1837 and imprisoned for 3 months. Together they had 3 children, Mary, Harriet and Thomas. But Anne wasn't the only woman in William Saville's life. He had persuaded his wife to take their children and live in a workhouse, and he then began a relationship with Elizabeth Tate of Radford. He planned to elope with her to America and had begun to sell all of the furniture in his house to pay for the fare. On the day before the murder, he asked Elizabeth Tate to marry him. She said no, as she had heard a rumour that he was already married. And he said, no, he wasn't married, he wasn't. But Elizabeth said, even if he wasn't married to the children's mother, he was still their father, and his obligation was to protect them. So the motive for the murders seemed quite clear. William Saville was of average height, about 5'5". His complexion was described as sallow, almost olive. He had dark eyes and hair, a long nose, and a heavy and gloomy countenance. He was about 30 years old at the time of his murder. So the scene of the crime. This was a small wood or spinney amongst Colic woods, and the place later became known as Saville Spinney, a typical British dark humorous resort to an atrocity. Now in 1848, 4 years after the murder, the Lincoln to Nottingham railway line opened, and the line crossed over the lane which led between Carlton and Colic, and which led through Saville Spinney. This place was described as a wood of natural beauty. The 3 children and their mother were found with their throats cut from ear to ear. On the 1st of June, the Leicestershire Mercury reported the coroner's inquest into the murders of the 3 children and their mother. They heard how Saville was involved with Miss Tate at Radford, and they heard evidence from John Swinscoe, who was looking for food for his rabbits and saw what he thought was 3 sleeping children. Upon approaching them, he saw the blood and then he ran for help. Mr. Parr came and the bodies were eventually taken to his house. The woman, Anne, was not found immediately because the grass was very long at this time in the middle of summer. One child was seen looking at the sky, and the boy was lying face down with his head on one of his sister's feet, and there was a trail of blood between the children and his mother. They were only about 10 yards from the path, but they lay for 3 to 4 days before they were found. The prisoner cried when he heard this evidence given. The inquest was adjourned and he was allowed to return to the jail, but he was followed by an abusive crowd. There was much evidence that he had been seen going into the spinney about noon with his family and coming out later looking very pale and alone. Now, he'd been arrested on the Wednesday afternoon, the day after the murder, by Samuel Wilkinson, the Inspector of Police. He saw blood on Saville's trousers, but Saville claimed he had had a nosebleed. Elizabeth Tate gave evidence. She had known Saville about 11 weeks, and they had talked about getting married at some point. She had seen him at 5 o'clock the day before the murders, but she had dumped him because she'd discovered he was already married. At this point, she became hysterical and was removed from the court until she stopped screaming. Absalom Barnett, the master of Nottingham Union Workhouse, testified that the family were in the workhouse and left the Monday before the murder. Several people saw Saville either going into the woods with his family or coming out on his own. These included a brickmaker called John Barker and George Mathewson of Spenton, and another man called Mr. Brown, who saw the prisoner near to the scene of the crime. Saville cried. He said he had not been to Spinney for 3 years, and he had left his wife at Stanhope Street. He thought she had drowned herself and the children. Now, the coroner referred the crime to the assize court, and Saville was tried there. Evidence showed that he'd been seen carrying his son on his shoulders on the day of the murder. The family had been seen by many people. They also found a bottle of arsenic amongst his belongings. By now, Saville was not showing any emotion at all. He had already tried to feign madness, but he hadn't been believed, so he'd given up on that ruse. He appeared indifferent by all accounts. His confession was read out in the court. He says how he and his family left Mrs. Wardle's house, and he meant to drown them. He meant to push them in the weir at Colic, and he asked his wife to go to the woods. And he took his coat off and he sat, but the boys sat on it, the girls played, and his wife said, "I know you have a woman in Radford." Of course he denied it. Elizabeth again said, "I know you have a woman at Radford." He denied this, but then said, "Well, I do, but I don't respect her. And also, I don't want to live with you anymore, my darling wife." He told her he'd sold all his furniture, and he planned not to live with her and not to live with the children. And then he said that he left them. But he heard them crying from the road, and he rushed back, and he found that his wife had cut the throat of one of their children. And another child and the boy, they had all been murdered by the mother. So he said, "You are a brute, and I will serve you the same." And he pushed her backwards, and he cut her throat. And then he placed the razor in her hand to try to frame her for the murders of his children. He then walked away. He was then moved to the county jail, where he spent the days before his death. This is next to the Shire Court. The day of execution came on the 7th of August 1844. Before County Hall in High Pavement, Nottingham, there were over 30,000 people who would come to watch and be hanged. There were mainly women who wanted to see justice done to this villain. Some people arrived at 3 a.m. for a good view. Some arrived in St Mary's churchyard, which overlooked the execution site, so they could get a good view from the walls. By 5 a.m. people were arriving en masse, and before 8, every road leading to the county jail was full. The housetops, the windows, the lampposts, they were full of people clinging to them so that they could catch a glimpse of the execution. At 5 a.m, the chaplain administered spiritual consolation to the wretched man. At 6:30, he had his last breakfast, a pint of tea, half a pound of bread and some bacon. Then he remained with his chaplain until 7:40. The procession formed 2 under-sheriffs, the chaplain, the governor of the jail, the executioner. They put shackles round Saville's legs and arms, and the executioner unbuttoned his collar and placed the noose around Saville's neck. The prisoner remained cool. His conduct brought the unqualified disgust of every person present. He was not nervous at all. At 8 a.m, he was led to the scaffold, where he looked calmly at the crowd. The newspaper later wrote, "The pent-up feelings of the mob seemed to break forth in one loud and dismal yell, which resembled the bursting of a fearful tornado." Thousands viewed the hanging body before it was taken down to be examined by the medical gentleman of the town. Now, because Saville showed no emotion and he died very quickly, the crowd were not satisfied with the spectacle. There were also many pickpockets in the densely packed crowd, and lots of pushing and shoving, and the resistless force of the crowd began to surge away from the county jail towards Weekday Cross. Now, at the top of Garner's Hill, some people lost their footing, others fell over them. and an immense heap lay struggling in the midst. But the 30,000 strong crowd continued to push, and people began to fall down the very steep stairs at Garner's Hill. Over 18 people died, mostly by suffocation, although some were crushed. The newspaper later said, "The cries, groans and shrieks that rent the air were horrible, and no pen can describe the dreadful scene." 7 people died immediately, and others were taken to hospital. Over 150 were hurt. The Derby Mercury listed the names of the people that had died by the 14th of August. These included many children and women, including Mary Percival, 13, Mary Easthope, 14, and her brother Thomas, who was only 9, John Bednall, 14, and there was also John Spinks, a 70-year-old watchman at Mr. Thackeray's mill. He had his thigh amputated and was still in a very dangerous state, but later died. Yeah, he had been holding an infant in his arms when he collapsed. Many more were wounded, including very young children and infants, all due to an unsatisfactory hanging of a murderer. William Saville was buried in the courtyard behind Shire Hall. This was a common place for burying bodies of the executors, and in fact the building, the National Galleries of Justice, does indeed still run ghost tours where you may run into the spirits of William Saville. His headstone simply reads WS and the date of his death. Thank you for listening to another tale from the Disaster Dialogues, with history going horribly wrong. There will be more stories here for you soon. Please like and subscribe. Disaster Dialogues out.